Alrighty, hello everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. We're gonna go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for coming out and braving the rain to spend this Friday evening with us. My name is Amali and I'm the events director here at Books Are Magic. We are so excited to have Shastri, Akella, and Rakesh Satyal with us tonight to celebrate the launch of Shastri's debut novel, The Sea Elephants. Woo! But before we get into all of that, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's event is going to go. Okay, there we go. First off, we will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of tonight's discussion, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, Shastri will be signing and personalizing books at the alcove next to where you checked in. We'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. And lastly, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we would love to encourage you to buy a copy of The Sea Elephants online using the link in the live stream description. All right, let's get into this. Hailed as lyrical and heart-wrenching, The Sea Elephants follows Shagun, a young man in 1990s India who joins a traveling theater troupe to flee his father's abuse and threats of conversion therapy, as well as his own guilt over the deaths of his younger sisters. Shagun carries the Hindu myths of his childhood close to his heart as he brings them to the stage and grows as an actor, and in doing so begins to understand more about his own sexuality and gender expression. This is a gorgeous coming-of-age novel full of grace and compassion, and we can't wait to hear Shastri read from it tonight. Shastri Akella holds an MFA in creative writing and a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. His writing has appeared in Guernica, Electric Literature, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Rumpus, the Common, and World Literature Review, among others. The Sea Elephants is his debut novel. As I mentioned earlier, Rakesh Satyal joins Shastri in conversation tonight. Rakesh is an executive editor at Harper Via and the author of the novels Blue Boy and No One Can Pronounce My Name. All right, that is all for me without any further delay. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Shastri and Rakesh.
So this book, for my friends who are here, knows it's been like 8 years in the making, so it feels really nice to be sharing this work with you. I just want to, before I read, give a little shout out to Books Are Magic. When Books Are Magic started their Smithstow Street, and I was a broke graduate student at UMass Amherst, I made a trip once exclusively to go to Books Are Magic. And it so happened Emma Straub was there, and I completely fanboyed and told her I was there just for her bookshop. And she was very generous. She said, "You've sort of made this pilgrim trip to be at the bookshop, so whatever you get today is on the house." So she sent me off with a whole bunch of goodies and a Books Are Magic tote bag. So it feels really special to be reading here today. So I thought I could also show you some pictures that I took from my street theater travels, and instead of giving you a lot of context up ahead of time, I can just put that up on the screen, so that way you won't forget everything I tell you ahead of time. The Cauldron Hours. During the 5-week winter break, I stayed back in the dorm, as did a few other boys who lived far away, but we didn't mingle. I went out exploring one afternoon. I left the dorm's backyard and entered the woods. There I saw a giant black cauldron on a plot cleared of trees but crowded with wild shrubs and weeds. Our laundryman told me that the cauldron was once used to make large batches of broth for English travelers during the busy summer months, April through July. An underground pit, now sealed, was fed with logs of cedar that smoldered and released a smoke that smelled, he said, of pine and sandalwood. I borrowed a ladder from the pantry, leaned it against the cauldron, and made my way up. Then, sitting on the thick iron edge, I picked the ladder up, leaned it on the inner wall, and descended rung by rung into a paler light. Dry leaves, trapped inside, formed a bed that crunched when I lay down with my hands tucked under my head. The clear sky was speckled with flocks of birds, pheasants and finches, miners and bulbuls. At times their feathers, blue or green, ended the tapered descent on my body. I felt contained here in my flesh. On New Year's Eve, the boys who remained at Magpies for the break wore rented blazers and helped one another with ties inherited from fathers. They slipped on boots that they'd spent the better part of the morning scrubbing with old toothbrushes. They showed off their fake IDs to one another as they left. They each belonged in their forged document to a new state. They had a new birthday. After they left, I picked up a thick blanket and went to lay down in the cauldron. When the clock struck midnight and 1990 came to be, I watched the fireworks that soared into the night in time to distant explosions and flared into circles of red and orange against the starry sky. I clapped for them. I felt sad for their evanescent lives. I fell asleep and awoke in the wee hours to the drunken songs of my classmates, muffled but audible as they re-entered the building. I pictured their bodies huddled together and trading heat as they walked through the cold night. I corresponded with Ma regularly. It was in the cauldron that I read the book Ma sent me as a New Year's gift, her copy of the Dravidian book of seas and stargazing. That winter, I performed the sea elephant stories in my dorm room on evenings when it was empty, when the boys who were straddlers like me went into town. Rusty's bed became the demon, the wicked cousin, the crooked uncle. It received a thorough thrashing. Viren's bed, the traitor minister, the spineless prince, the soldier who flees the battlefield. I assigned roles to Mud and Milk and stood still when it was their characters' turn to speak. Sometimes I heard their voices, clear, unbleached. My sisters and I once performed the story of the fallen prince Arjuna, who angers a god and is cursed to be a woman for a year. I played him, Mud, the god who curses him, Milk, the god who cures him. Why is it a curse to be a woman anyway? I inquired. Milk made fun of me. So sad, so sad. The author died 1 million years ago, and he isn't here for your stupid Q&A. Big help he'd be, Mud scoffed, as if he knows what a woman's curse is. School reopened and the boys came back smelling of talcum powder, lemon pickles, mango chutney, and long hours spent in clean, sun-dried bedsheets. I went to the cauldron on Sunday afternoons only when my classmates napped or went into town. I didn't want them to invade my territory. Despite my discretion, I was discovered one day. I heard him walk up to the cauldron and around to the far side. "Don't ask me to come in," he said. "We can be friends, but only like this." I said, "When I'm in the cauldron?" "And me outside. If you see me, you'll identify me in the dawn. And if I do, you'll lose all your friends." "You got it. So, friends?" We exchanged a variation of a handshake. He tapped 3 times in the outside, I tapped 3 times in the inside. And that was how, early in that spring of 1990, I found my first and only friend at Magpies, a boy I never saw, only met across the iron curve of my cauldron. He was from the state of Bihar. He told me about the vacations they took in the Ratnagiri hills, where the Buddha preached the Lotus Sutra, the cricket games he played in the ruins of Nalanda. I told him about the seaside town where I grew up, the horse carriages that picked up foreign men at our port. I never told him that my sisters died. He said, "I never saw the sea." I said, "Who knows, maybe you'll live by the sea someday." "I'll never leave Bihar. I have to be a cop when I grew up. It's practically the family business of the men in our house." "You always have a choice," I said. With a piece of chalk, I drew my friends' faces. I drew many faces, smiling, serious, thoughtful, 20 faces in white on the cauldron's black interior. Each time he spoke to me from the other side of the cauldron, I looked at one of the faces and associated it with his voice. The next time I met my cauldron friend, I told him about the man whose name I didn't know, who I called Furniture. The tea he drank, his love for swimming on Thursdays, his infrequent homecomings. I concealed the vital part, that he was my first crush. So I was surprised by his response. "It's okay if you like him," he said. "Why wouldn't it be okay?" I asked. "You know what I'm saying," he said. He leaned forward and tapped the cauldron. "Have you?" I asked, leaning forward. "You seem so sure." He didn't reply. I looked at one of his chalked faces that had a smile. "You've done it," I cried. "Behave yourself," he scolded. "You're right, and it was special, and that's all you're getting." There was a protracted silence. I pressed my ear to the cool iron wall and heard his shallow breathing as if he'd fallen asleep. Then he spoke about putting things in a bag and going away somewhere. "Some place where we can be whatever we want," he said. "Wouldn't that be nice?" It was hard to disagree with that sentiment. Stop there.
I was just thinking how it's a pity they don't really make those big print telephone books anymore, because I could hand you one of those and listen to you read it. You have such a beautiful speaking voice. I love hearing writers read their work in their own voices, because you really hear the kind of rhythm of the writing, and you have such a beautiful music to the writing that is in this book. And as you can all probably gather, it's kind of surprising to think of it as a debut, because the voice is so assured. I wanted to begin by asking you about, as you probably gathered from that reading, about private school culture in Magpies, in the school that he attends in this book. There's a lot of bullying, and it's really homophobic bullying. And I think I mentioned to you in one of our messages, that I worked on a book by a writer named Satyal, who wrote about, called it An Indefinite Sentence, about, it was a memoir about his enduring a great deal of homophobic abuse in that private school system. And a lot of it comes from a kind of British colonialist sensibility that gets passed down to people. So I'd love for you to kind of talk about what that culture is like and how it informs of these early parts of the book, because we really see what a difficult time he has navigating that world. And it seems to have a lot of different layers and hierarchies to it that you navigate early on in the book.
Yeah, I think it's such a hangover from colonial times, like you said, where there is, part of it is a fascination with English as a language, and the idea that if you go to a boarding school, most of them are taught, there's a boarding school which was, when I was growing up, taught entirely by Scottish. It was a Scottish missionary school, so it was taught by Scottish migrants living in India. And so there was such a sense of looking up to these white-skinned men who were teaching these classes, and such an obsession with the way they sounded. Some of the television that did so well in India when I was growing up came not from India, but from England. So I think it all sort of adds onto that same constellation, and then along with the obsession with England, there is that additional layer of economic benefits of knowing English. So then you're sent there. But the thing is, a lot of culture in India by default, as I'm sure you know, is not homophobic to begin with. That was something I was really trying to embrace with this book, that there are so many queer characters in Hindu mythology. And homosexuality was not criminalized in India until the British came and set the constitutional rule. So when you have a school structure that is really trying to replicate the school structure of the English school system, it inherits all of its vices as well, including homophobia. And a lot of times it's also about performance. I think the worst thing you can do is to put a group of adolescent boys high on hormones in one place that's bound to explode in one way or the other. And then you throw in colonial fascination, shame about colonial fascination, and performance. I mean, it's a ticking time bomb. It explodes every single day. So
I remember when I was in high school, I had to go to, I don't know if you ever did Boys State or Girls State, but it's this very kind of, it's sponsored by the American Legion, and you go to have a mock government, and we all were taking over a college campus for this thing, and I was just dreading it because it was exactly what you described. It was this sort of really kind of heteronormative, but all these men gathered in one place, and I was just so terrified, and we all had to be grouped into dorm rooms, and I was terrified. And then I remember almost a shaft of light coming through the window because I opened the door and I had a single, and it was such a surprise. I was so thrilled I was by myself because I was just terrified of how to navigate that world for an entire week. But yes, I mean, I think what you create in those early chapters is a kind of literal sort of enclosure of sorts that he's in, where he has to navigate his burgeoning sexuality and his understanding of it, and being in that place. And I assume a lot of those choices were quite intentional, especially with the cauldron, for example. You create an exact space for him to be in where he's protected from other people. And that seems to repeat itself throughout the book, that there are these moments of kind of refuge that he finds. And that seems pretty intentional on your part, that you wanted to create these moments where he can sort of escape from other people and from the things that are pressing down on him, right?
Yeah, it's. I just remember this as I heard you talk. The high school I went to, there was a girls' high school counterpart to it. So they would once a year, sort of like a replication of prom, bring everyone together. So you could, if a guy wanted to dance with a girl, you could send a message. And a big obsession in the 90s when I was in high school was if you really liked the girl and if you were one of the jocks, you would write her name in your blood on a card. And you would post that, or you would send that, and especially if some of the popular girls would see, okay, how much blood has been used, and then, it was such a part of the conversation, and I was like terrified because I didn't want to, be part of that whole thing. So then I would find my own enclosure. So every time they'd come in to collect these cards, I would just find a place to hide.
Yes.
One of the things which I eventually got cut out from this book, just because the first draft was 850 pages, I had to find things to cut. So I did this little job where I would go and work in a lighthouse. I was a lighthouse, like a keeper sort of a thing, and that was my refuge, where you sort of find oneness with an element. For me, it was the sea, and I found that oneness with an element which was just vast, which you could almost feel insignificant. Sometimes when you're when you're trekking the hills, when you're going by the sea, there's something almost like beautiful to feeling like you don't matter. Because if you don't matter, none of your troubles matter either. So I think that those enclosures in the cauldron, when he's there, there's this massive history. This thing has existed before he did. It's going to exist even after he leaves. And so somehow in associating himself with something like that, with the birds, with the sky, he can for a moment feel insignificant, and there's like something beautiful about that insignificance.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the things you capture so well, and this is not a spoiler because you find this out on the first page, but the character sort of blames himself for the fact that his two twin sisters drown, and that there's an incident that happens where that's the case. And and it is this amazing thing where you capture the beauty of the sea, but it's very fearsome at the same time. And over the course of the story, that seems to recur, the idea that there's this physically beautiful place, but that it has this kind of terrifying element to it. And that also seemed to be a kind of similar presence, where at these moments of refuge, there's something that contains these multitudes. There's both fear and kind of comfort wrapped in that. And that seemed, to set it there, that was probably a juxtaposition that you considered a great deal, right? The fact that the sea is both at once beautiful, but that also can be quite menacing at the same time.
Yeah, I grew up by the sea, and I think for me it has that idea of home, sea as a place of home. And there's like a line that is there somewhere in the book where it's said about the father that he loved the sea so much that the father's mom jokes that, when you get a letter, we'll just post it in the sea because that's your real home. And for me, the ocean was that kind of a place. But home can also be, it's both the sense of the familiar, it's your childhood, and most of us view our childhood as idyllic, but if you have a certain history associated with home, it's also a source of immense terror. So there's a juxtaposition of, you can experience the comfort of home, but only under certain parameters. And that was what I was trying to create for Shaban's experience, where he's able to experience the ocean, but only under his parameters. And sometimes there's a certain, the way seclusion has a beauty, there's a beauty to exile, where you have to necessarily completely uproot yourself and go to a new place. Not speaking from experience at all, but that's the only situation in which you can truly be who you are. And that means sometimes leaving a place, a geography that you really like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, to your point that you were just making in a slightly different way, I know you kind of left one professional life to kind of take up the more sort of creative writerly life. And I think that many people can speak to that experience, the idea of sort of making time, carving out time for your own personal artistic expression. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that experience, the idea of kind of being in a sort of corporatized culture and trying to find, as you've noted, you worked in this book for 8 years, so there are a lot of different venues and places that you were writing it in. So could you talk a little bit about navigating that? How you went from, you know, what can often be a very limiting corporate setting to something that is basically just completely contingent on your own creativity to complete.
Yeah, I think it was very confounding to my parents for those reasons, because I was working for Google. I worked with them for a good almost 5.5, 6 years. I worked also out of their Dublin office and their San Francisco office, but I did take a leave on loss of pay in between to travel with the street theater troupe. And when my father found out, and it was leave on loss of pay, you couldn't just go away for 2 months and expect a salary. My father was horrified when he found out. He said, "Street theater?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Those people who go perform in small squares and collect money in a hat." I said, "Yeah." He said, "You took 2 months of loss of pay for that." And I was so surprised that he couldn't get it, which now I think I get his perspective better. But in that moment, for me, there couldn't seem like a better option. And similarly, quitting, I'd gotten promoted to a managerial level, and then I quit to do an MFA in creative writing. And I went from earning a pretty decent salary to going on tiership salaries. And I think every time I would question that, I would, in my mind, sort of reconfigure, saying, but what is it that truly matters to me? I think anytime, even through, it took me 1.5 years, almost 2 years to find my agent, Chris, through those rejections that I would get, I would ask myself, should I leave this book? Should I start something else new? And I said, do I care for these characters? Do these stories matter to me? And the answer was just so resounding, I knew I couldn't let them go. So I think for me, navigating these spaces, the decisions at a logistical level were complicated, but at a value-based level, they were very easy decisions to make, because when I would ask myself this question of, is this something that would matter to you 5 years from now? And I said, absolutely, this story would matter to me 5 years from now. With the Google job, would that matter to you 5 years from now? The answer was a very clear no.
I love that you mentioned that, because I think it's something that people, even we as writers, can often forget, which is that when we create something, that it kind of exists and we feel a responsibility to keep creating it and to finish what we started. And I think with every project, there's this moment, this tipping point where you think, oh, if I don't, it's so simple, but if I don't do this, nobody's going to complete this story. It actually started, and now I have the responsibility to complete it and do it. One of the questions I had for you was about street theater and about your experience with that medium. And, I was wondering if you could speak kind of, in India in particular, what role that art form seems to have, both for the community and then both in this kind of travel itinerant aspect that you described so beautifully in the book, because it seems to occupy a slightly different role in the way people acknowledge it, the way people know about it or don't know about it, versus what we think of here, which is that it's pretty localized when people think of theater here. If it's a traveling troupe, it's a pretty established theater company that goes into pretty established theaters. But what you're describing in the book is a bit more free form and a bit more kind of open to the vicissitudes of performance and where things are located. So could you talk a bit about what that scene is really like?
Sure. I mean, I actually found them just quite by happenstance. When I started writing this book, I didn't know I wanted to bring in street theater. It started with a very specific image of this character transferring a picture from one wall to another wall. And one wall has pictures of the living and the other has pictures of the dead. This is again in the second chapter. And that was the originating image. And so I sort of journaled. There are very few pictures left on the wall of the living, and he locks his house and leaves. And then I started to journal, well, when he leaves and goes out into the world, what is it that he's looking for? And at the time, I thought I was asexual, and I said, okay, he's looking for platonic forms of intimacy, and where can he find them? I didn't have an answer to that question at the time, and then I started traveling. I was in the Delhi office of Google, and then I traveled, and I saw a street performance. It was my first encounter with Nautanki, and there are like 16 forms, at least 16 known documented forms of street theater, each very different from the other. And what really struck me with that form of theater is that there was such an intimacy between the performer and the spectators. The performers they were performing by the banks of the Ganges. The performance was happening and we all stood in a circle. And the nature sounds were coming by into the performance. There were people were honking, talking, somebody was selling vegetables. All those sounds, ambient sounds, became a part of the performance. And in some ways, as somebody who had no humanities education, I came from a very comp sci background, I was just so struck by that. It felt like as somebody who has no art education, who's not elitist at all, background or education-wise, it felt very accessible to me. It felt like that was a reality that I could be a part of. And there was this one moment that I very distinctly remember where the performance, one of the actors who was performing made eye contact with me and talked about war. And it's because it was a scene from the Mahabharata and he was talking about war, and it just was talking to me as if, because the street theater is always performed in the present tense, and he was talking about war in the present tense while I was sitting there and just watching him. So that had a very profound influence on me. So then I spoke to them and said, can I travel with you? I'll write for you. And that's when I traveled with them for a month and a half. And I think that was, for me, one of the most transformative experiences. If I hadn't, that's where I took some of these pictures. If I had not done that, then I don't think this book would really be here.
Right, and one of the great tensions of the book and things that he's exploring is the fact that theater is very much a physical art form, and that there's a certain freedom that comes from exploring in that medium. But then he's dealing with very, very serious psychosomatic repercussions of going through trauma and assault from a young age, and trying to realize those desires in a physical way when eventually things turn romantic for him. And so there's a real, and that to me was very thematically the real undercurrent of the book, is the idea of how do you take this trauma that becomes manifest within yourself and find some outlet that allows you to live your own truth in your own life. And that really seemed to be the great tension that theater was playing there. Can you also talk about that too, the idea of how theater, it demands a great deal from you physically to perform it, and yet there can be a lot of self-doubt wrapped into that that maybe prevents you from even attaining or tapping into that ability. And that seemed to be something that you wrote about a great deal in the novel.
Yeah, because one of the freeing things for me when I witnessed the theater and then it sort of became part of the story was the actors. It was an all-male troupe. They were all, except for two of them, everyone else was farmers. So they would farm during their farming season, then join the street theater troupe. And they would perform all the roles. So the male, female, and transgender characters were performed by men. And there was such, just as witnessing them, such a liberating sense of freedom to not limit your gender assigned at birth to the kind of clothing you're wearing, the kind of character and emotion you're embodying. And I wanted that to somehow be a part of the story. But like you were saying, so Shagun's character, he's performing all these roles, and yet when one of his fellow actors says, you're very comfortable in feminine clothing, maybe you should consider wearing that beyond the stage or beyond the performance, he really resists that, because that internalized idea of how clothing is gendered, something inanimate like clothing can become so gendered, and he's not able to get over that. But that clothing being gendered is only it's like a surface level conflict. There are so many, like the hierarchy of gender is so structured within us, and we've internalized this. We've read it, seen it, witnessed it, and internalized it to an extent that it takes a lot. So I think in some ways it makes you aware of these limitations, but it also makes you confront these limitations that you sort of internalized and sort of brings them to the surface. There's Charles Baxter has this amazing quote about subtext where he says, subtext is something that sort of festers in the margins of a story until at some point some conflict causes it to explode to the surface. And once it explodes to the surface, you cannot ignore it anymore. And for me, that sort of tension where he's performing these feminine characters but doesn't want to embody his own femininity, that comes to a head in a later scene.
It also, in reading the book, it made me think a great deal about how, and this is so relevant these days, but that people almost have a greater capacity for accepting these the fluidity of gender expression when they think it's confined to the theater. So their minds open to a certain level of creativity and acknowledging something that's at a remove. And they almost permit themselves to imagine that with a freedom that they then cannot implement when that ends, when they then try to bring that into real life. And that again seems to be the sort of tension that you're navigating with his character too, because he himself is seeing the way society reacts to that and how they're unable sometimes to bring the freedom they allow the theater troupe to explore when they're performing. I thought I'd bring up a question that might lead you into the next reading that you were going to do about found family, because that really is a great theme that seems to emerge in the book. The idea that not just in this troupe but other friends that come along in the novel, that people really do provide almost the comfort that one would expect from families, so to speak, to then come from other places. And I found the characters were so well delineated in terms of seeing what they were bringing to him, and in a way, they all kind of put together. It's funny, the Wall of the Living and the Wall of the Dead is such a beautiful device that you use over the course of the book, and I kept thinking about how the Wall of the Living did keep growing. I mean, there's a point later in the book when you nod to that, but how over the that wall is kind of growing in tandem with the book because you're seeing the people who come into his life. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that concept of found family and how it really seemed to inform the momentum of the book.
I think because I came out here when I was in the MFA program here, I came out writing this book because in the first draft, Shagun was asexual and Mark, who's now his boyfriend, was his friend. And in the MFA program, one of our professors, Sabina, she said, well, this is, it feels like it really wants to be, it's aching to be a gay love story was the phrase she used, and she pointed to the subtext where it was clear that Shagun desired Mark. And so I took therapy and came out, and it's like sort of this like running joke between us now, between Sabina and me. I said I took your class and had to go to therapy right after. But I came out in the workshop on the last day of a workshop, and really my friends from the MFA program, some of my friends from India who came here, including some who were still in India, they became my family to me because at that time I could not really have these conversations with my biological family, and my relationship with some of them became very volatile. I was also around that time, I read this book by Andrew Solomon called Far From the Tree, and he talks about this idea of vertical and horizontal identities, where there is the identity of the biological family, where you follow the family business, you inherit the family estate, you do what your parents did. If your father was an engineer, then you are an engineer as well. But then there is the apple that falls far from the tree, and each chapter in that book is written from an apple that falls from the tree. One of them is like a queer character, because Andrew Solomon is queer. So when a child is queer, it's hard for the parents to accept, because even the idea of having a child, the word we use is reproduction. Because in reproduction, you assume that the child will be a replica of the parent, and oftentimes they're not. And I think I'm sort of straying a little bit here, but I was thinking of Khalil Gibran, who talks about how your children are not your children, they're expressions of life's longing for itself. And so when you look at it from that perspective, your children are not going to be necessarily like you. So when you are that apple that falls far from the tree, one way to truly survive and thrive is to go out into the world and find your own family and sort of build around that horizontal identity of a found family. So yeah, that's the next section I wanted to read.
I love this idea of we've all been in that creative writing class where the professor is like, here, why don't you read this so you can come out finally? Because that seems to happen a great deal.
So this, just very quick context, Shagun's under like a lot of threat from this very homophobic cop, and he's trying to escape, and so this whole scene is about his friends who are trying to help him escape. Over the last few months, it acquired a Ken doll, which feels very appropriate for a comedy coming out, a retro outfit in the Dravidian Book of Seas and Stargazing, Volume 2. I packed them along with my clothes to the attache it arrived with. The bed was stripped, the room empty, ready for the next occupant. When Sue came over, we took my attache to the balcony and sat on it. She pressed my head to her shoulder and let me cry. When she sensed that the storm of my grief had subsided for now, she let me go. What do you want? She asked, like from life. I want a celebration, I said. I want to perform something beautiful and intimate with Rue and Saya. I want you to come see Mark and me running off into our bridal night. I know I want Ma to be there too when that happens. I mean, why not if wishes were horses and all that? Run off into our bridal night, Sue mocked. You're such a drama queen, you laughed. You want a celebration? You'll get one. Sue walked with me up one floor. My students, all 6 of them, were in Nandi's room. So were the other members of my troupe. We commenced preparations to stage my escape from Chamba from Ajay Biswas's satellite. We traded our clothes for costumes. The room, like a green room, was lamplit, and in the light of those flames, the bowls of makeup resembled precious stones. Green like emerald, red like ruby, blue like lapis lazuli. The only movement was the hand of our makeup man, whose brush traced the contours of our faces, leaving in its wake trails of color, bright and viscous. Nandi started to sing a song, and Rue joined him, and then Saya, and then me. The makeup man's mouth twitched into a smile, even as his gaze was fixed on the faces our faces were becoming. Sue and my students listened to us, and every time we repeated the chorus, they hummed along. It was a song from the Hindu Romantic era, the Bhakti period, when art blurred the border between devotion and love, when a lover's home became your sacred address, and he, your lover, in all his fragile mortality, was no less a miracle than a god. Even after we stopped singing, we continued to hum, falling quiet one after the other, so the silence that followed felt like a continuation of, rather than a punctuation to the song. We waited, sitting upright on the bed, on the floor, our hands in our laps. We heard our cue, a trumpet, a drum, a ululation, a human throat producing a song that was in the register of bird song. We filed down the stairs and exploded out of the gate, a messy flesh conglomerate, the slow rhythm of a movement escalating into something rowdier, explosive almost. I at the epicenter, my face painted white, on my head a wig made of jute strings surrounded by a wall of dancing bodies. Sue had my attache. From the corner of my eye, I saw my satellite, a quick, blurred glimpse. 7 musicians surrounded us and drowned us in their music. In tandem, they blew their trumpets and struck the goatskin heads of their drums. We started to move like one body, teeming with multiple heads and limbs. We left the alleyway and entered the school's main street. Then out we went, leaving the campus behind onto Market Street. Along the way, people joined us, college students, shoppers with bags of produce, couples out on evening walks. The junta surrounded the musicians who surrounded us as we moved along. 3 winding streets later, we saw a parked minivan at one corner. The goodbyes began as we continued to move. The musicians sustained their music at crescendo as strangers danced all around us. As I left the town where I met and lost the man I loved. I twirled in a circle from Nandi to Rue to Saya. I gave them each a hug, pressed their bodies to mine, pressed my head to their necks, their shoulders. 3 rounds, 3 hugs for each of those humans whom I loved, who miraculously loved me in return. The shoulder of my costume was smudged with their makeup. We slowed but didn't stop as our bodies surrounded the minivan, pushed against it, causing it to jolt back and forth. The driver slid open the back door, leaned his upper body out, and waved his fist at us. Sue slid the attache into the van. I crouched amid oppressive bodies and entered the van through the same open door. I took my wig off and handed it to Saya. Nandi and Rue towered over the rest as they pretended to argue with the driver. Lying flat, with my stomach pressed to the attache, I watched the face of Sue, painted blue, and of Saya, painted green, the red of their eyes made redder against the surrounding palette of colors. Nandi struck the minivan with his fist, and the driver slipped his body in and slid the door shut. Rue and Nandi pressed their hands to the van's windows and our eyes met. They were surrounded now by the people of Chamba. They were falling behind. They thumped the car once more with their palms, and then they were gone. I closed my eyes and listened to the music and their cries, relishing this oral contact, until I heard a rap on the window, wood and glass. The driver lowered his window. "This is no place to park," a stern voice said. It was my satellite, I guessed. "Sorry, sir, I stopped for a cigarette and was about to go when they almost wiped me out." My eyes were closed. He started the engine, and just like that, we drove away. The procession was headed for the railway station, where my troop members would board the train and the others would depart. When the satellite checked them, as I knew he wouldn't find me. The driver pulled to the side of the road. With 2 bottles of water, I washed my makeup off. He then left me at the Uttarkashi railway station. As I stood on the platform with my attache and watched my train pull in, I stuffed a hand into my trouser pocket and found a piece of paper. I fished it out. Written on it in Hindi, "This isn't goodbye, Nandi, Rue, Saya." Mark had said those words to me in a different language. The resonance was comforting. His promise, traveling through time, finding its place in Nandi's ink. I cried for all the tentative departures from my life, for the love that tentativeness contained.
So I'd love to talk to you a little bit before we open it up to questions about your experience with your agent and your editor during this. As you might know, I work in publishing, so I always love to ask this question because I love to hear people's sort of creative background. So can you talk a little bit about that process, how it worked for you? I mean, like you noted, it was an 850-page manuscript that then became probably, a 350-page manuscript, so there's a lot of work to be done. So can you talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, after I cut it, I knew I basically broke my MFA's systems. After I graduated, they put a page limit on how long your manuscript can be. And then I took a break because I started my PhD, edited the book down, and then I started looking for an agent. It took me, like I said, almost a year and a half, 2 years to find Chris. I was basically a Word document in his slush pile. And then he picked that up. I sent him 50 pages and he liked it. And he was one of my dream agents. I was very excited to hear from him. And so after getting almost a year and a half of rejections, it so happened that in 1 week in April, the stars must have been aligned. I ended up getting 3 offers from 3 agents, and I knew Chris was the one I wanted to work with. So, and then he, of course, he and I edited the book some more. I think a big part of the edit, which I'm going to embarrass myself by saying this, was the main character is really obsessed with the fact that his boyfriend has red hair. So there was like so many descriptions, and Chris was like, okay, we get it. You can maybe just tone this down a little bit.
Did you cut those 100 pages talking about the red hair? Yeah.
So that, and then so it did become a lot tighter. And then he sent it out to editors. And the first editor I spoke to was Carolyn, who became my editor. It was supposed to be, Chris set me up saying it's going to be a 30-minute call. We spoke for, I think, an hour and 45 minutes. And I just loved her immediately. And I knew she was the one I wanted to work with. And so I told Chris that, and he said, well, I'll try and make that happen. And he made that happen. And she's been amazing to work with. She's just so good with structure, because the structure was still not, I knew it was not where it had to be, but I couldn't figure out what the right structure should be. And then she figured it out. For me, she also came up with the title of the book. So yeah, I think I'm just very, very fortunate to find like a dream agent and dream editor team.
That's wonderful. Just so you know, that's very rare that happens, where the author and the editor form that kind of relationship very early on. So that's wonderful. And also, the book is structured very intentionally, and that's a really big part of the way that it kind of moves, and because it has elements of sort of mystery or a thriller in it that emerge more and more the second half too. So it really benefits from that work. So I'd love to open it up to questions if people have them. I know we're running a little bit late on time, but ask them. Don't be afraid. Shastri wasn't afraid to write the book, so that's the least you can do. But yes, please ask them and we'll answer. Yes, please.
I feel like there's this conception of like queerness as like a thing from like the Western side of the world often, and it seems to me like by having this queer Indian character involved in like a sort of traditional like Indian art, you're sort of making the argument that like it isn't so foreign, and so I just wanted to ask about that and like why like that is something that matters to you, or like what it means to you to like make that connection.
I'll just paraphrase for the people who are streaming, just so they can hear the questions. So the question's about the idea that queerness is often sort of misappropriated to being a Western concept or a Western ideal, and yet the book really interrogates this idea of sexuality or queerness being both Eastern and then a kind of evidence in the book by an Eastern performing art. So that seems to be something that speaks to you, and could you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, when I was traveling with the street theater troupe, thank you for that question, because it's something that I'm very passionate about, so I'm more than happy to answer it. I'll keep the answer short, but it's when I was traveling with the street theater troupe and I saw them perform these queer characters, like Chitrangada is a trans character who also falls in love with a female character of Draupadi, who's revered as this goddess, and if anybody tries to on Bollywood, on the Hindi film screen, show that romance, they're going to probably be killed. But that romance exists, like it's been censored out of translations. And then that really stayed with me. And after I came out, I was looking for contemporary South Asian Desi fiction that is queer. And I found 2 writers. I found Rakesh's Blue Boy, and I found Neil Mukherjee, who's a South Asian writer based out of the UK. And it just felt like I desire to make it a queer contemporary fiction became even stronger, because if we have this rich tradition, we should have more queer contemporary voices. And from the time I started writing to now, we have more queer South Asian writers. But for me in this book, I was trying with this book to sort of add contemporary queer South Asian stories to the lineage of these stories that were written thousands and thousands of years back, to sort of show and give them the weight of that history that they deserve.
More questions? Yes.
So you mentioned that you worked on this book for about 8 years. So my question is, how did you balance sort of letting the book and the characters grow and letting yourself discover more about them, while balancing it with the original story that you wanted to tell and the message you wanted to convey over that time?
A very good question. So the question is about, since you mentioned working on the book for 8 years, how did the original idea you had for the book, how did you square that with how the characters were changing and the story was changing as you were writing the book over that time?
I just want to say Shubha is my student at Deerfield Academy, so super happy to see you here. I think for me it was, I did outline the novel a little bit once I saw how much I cut out. I didn't want to spend more time writing 100 pages that I knew I'd end up cutting out. And so that sort of understanding, I think for me, having a structure and outline was liberating rather than like imposing, rather than limiting. And so once I found out what my characters, what I really wanted them to be, where I wanted them to go, then I sort of worked my way back. I wanted the characters to sort of face that discomfort of their gender identity and have other characters who are much more open-minded about that. And when they're friends, because found family, I think they're there for you, but they also don't shy away from healthy confrontation or if they feel like it's going to foster your growth. So Shagun's found family becomes that sort of healthy confrontational space for him, where they say, you can live a fuller life, why aren't you letting yourself live that space? So I think I took these destinations where I wanted the character to be. They will grow, of course, keep growing as we all do, but by the time the book ended, what kind of growth stage I wanted them to reach, where were they, what kind of conflicts would they face, and who would sort of help these conflicts rise to the surface. So it was, for me, I think once I started really getting into the book and the revision of the book, it was really about understanding what craft elements I wanted and sort of marrying those with where I wanted to see these characters go.
One or two more questions? Yeah, yes. Yes, go for it. You in the green, yes.
Shastri, you mentioned that one of the aspects of street theater that is so unique is its physicality. But you were joined the troupe as a writer, and then you chose to write a novel about a performer. And so I'm interested in kind of that relationship between performance and observation, and if mentally stepping into a different theatrical role considered any
Beautifully phrased question that I'm about to mangle because you said it so beautifully, but the idea of entering a theater troupe as in a kind of writerly position as somebody who observes, but it's a performance kind of based medium. How did you kind of square those two things together?
I think part of it was my, as a reader, I have a bit of a pet peeve when writers write about writing. It feels like a bit of a cop-out. So it's just, which is not to say those books don't have room or space, but that's not something I ever wanted for myself. So I didn't want him to be a writer. So that was like sort of the surface level decision. But I think the more I wrote this book, the more I lived with it. I realized one of the conflicts was I myself was like, trying to work through my own gender identity even after I came out. I had these very inherited notions of what kind of clothing, jewelry. 3 years back, I wouldn't be wearing this massive ring, but now I sort of give myself the permission to do it. So when I was writing this book, I wanted Shagun to sort of embody, the feminine side, but I was not able to do it if it was not a performance. So I think once he was performing, once he was an actor, once he was on stage, I gave myself the freedom because it's written in first person. I was able to sort of put a little bit of distance and then create that femininity for him, which then his family observes and underscores. So I think they were very personally motivated, like one from a pet peeve and one from me sort of navigating my own gender identity.
One last question? Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
I just want to know, how did the title come about for the story? Like, what is the story behind that? I'm always curious about it.
So to your point earlier, the title got suggested by your editor. How did you land on that title in the end?
So it's one of the principal myths that's performed. Like the story starts off with a reading of the story of the sea elephants, and then that becomes a key performance later on in the book. So it goes from a text that's read to a text that's performed, and it is the story of these sea elephants, Airavat, who's there's like this old ancient Hindu myth where the ocean is churned and a lot of treasures come up, and one of the things that comes up is this elephant, pure pearl white elephant with 6 tusks. And the gods are so beguiled with him that they just take him away to heaven, saying he's ours now. And I remember I was like 7 or 8 when my grandmother read this story to me, and I interrupted her. I said, wait, how can they just take him away? What happens to his family? And she said, well, you can't question that. I said, well, just because you're a god, you can't act like a bully. And so then she stopped reading to me after that for a while. But I kept imagining this idea of what happens to the sea elephant's family, how do they process their trauma. And this idea of, in graduate class, I encountered the idea of intergenerational grief and trauma and how it manifests. So that's I built this myth around the sea elephant myth. And we were like, Chris and I were talking about titles. We came up with Shagun, we came up with Chitrangada, who's like the trans character Shagun performs. But I really wanted elephant in my title. But we somehow we couldn't come up with it. And when I spoke to Carolyn, she said, how about the sea elephants? I said, yeah, I somehow never did reach for that. So yeah, that's the story of the title.
Well, thank you so much. I really encourage all of you who have not read it yet, read it, buy it, give it to friends, buy copies for them. Support queer authors, support authors of color, and thank you to Books Are Magic, and thank you, Shastri.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. Thank you to Rakesh for moderating such a fantastic conversation. And thank you, of course, to Shastri for celebrating this launch with us. As I said earlier, Shastri will be around to sign and personalize your books. That's going to happen at the little table where my coworker Alexa is pointing to right now. It's a little bit hidden, but it'll all make sense shortly. We just ask that you kind of line up down the center aisle, curve around to the wall, and please make sure to grab all of your personal belongings with you so that we can start to break down and rearrange the space. Otherwise, we've got plenty of additional copies of The Sea Elephants available for purchase, as well as a few of Rakesh's novel, No One Can Pronounce My Name, which is also fantastic and a great accompanying read. So I would highly recommend checking that out as well. I believe that's it. Let's give these two one last round of applause. Thank you all so much for joining us.